What's up guys, Greg here with Lens Pro to Go and Lens Rentals. Today we're going to be checking out the Tokina Cinema ATX Zoom lenses. This is the 16 to 28. We're going to be running it through a bunch of different tests from flaring, breathing, checking if it's parfocal, bokeh, chromatic aberration, as well as edge distortion and sharpness. If you guys want to jump ahead to any of the specific tests, I'll throw links to all of them in the description below so you can jump ahead. So without further ado, let's jump into the first test looking at the 16 to 28 Tokina Cinema Zoom. So the first test that we're going to run on this lens is to see if it is parfocal. We're just zooming in to 28 millimeters, getting focus, and then zooming out to 16 millimeters. If it is parfocal, it should stay locked on that focus mark, and it definitely does do that, so this lens is parfocal. Next up, we're going to take a look at bokeh. First at 16 millimeters, we're focused at 1 feet 6 inches, and we're just going through the aperture range from T22 all the way wide open to a T3. Just like the 50 to 135, this has very circular bokeh, but it only has 9 blades in there, so it's kind of surprising that you're not really getting any hard edges, but it's nice to see that the bokeh is so circular and smooth with this lens. Then we'll jump into 28 millimeters, and we've moved our chart back to 2.5 feet now. And again, we're just going through the aperture range. Very similar bokeh, really circular through the whole aperture range, which is really nice to see, especially because, like I said, this only has 9 aperture blades in it, so you don't get any of those hard edges, which is great. Next up, we're going to take a look at the breathing, so racking focus from close focus to infinity. First, we're at 16 millimeters, all the way to close focus, and then out to infinity. This lens does a much better job than the 50 to 135, which is also in this set. There's barely any zooming in and out on the sides. You can, if you pay attention to it, notice a little bit, but you shouldn't have really a problem if you're following action and racking focus in a project. Up next, we're going to jump into 28 millimeters and do the exact same thing. So racking to close focus and then to infinity. I'm barely seeing any focus breathing with this lens. There's a slight shift if you look on the edges, but again, just like at 16 millimeters, you shouldn't have a problem with it in your project. Next, let's take a look at the edge distortion and sharpness. Here we are at 16 millimeters, and being such a wide angle lens, we're definitely going to have some distortion on the edges. As you can see, my face start to get stretched out a little bit. Also, the focus does shift backwards slightly, and with so much distortion on the edges, it's really hard to tell that sharpness difference anyway. And then we're just going to pan over to the other side. Again, you can see my face starting to get stretched out. Punching into 28 millimeters. Again, this is still a pretty wide focal length, so I would expect a little bit of stretching and distortion on the edges, but it's not too noticeable. Only really on the very, very edges are you getting a little bit of stretching. So right about here, this looks pretty good, all the way through the frame until we get to the other side. And then you start to see that stretching effect again. And then we'll take a look at chromatic aberration. And then just racking focus on either side of our subject, which is the light stand here with the light on it. We have it backlit with the light shining on that white board, and then we have a darker foreground object so you can see any of that chromatic aberration effect. And this lens, just like the 50 to 135, it does a really good job at controlling this. And here we are punched into 28 millimeters, where you are seeing a little bit more of that magenta color fringing on the edges, but it's still not that bad, and you can only really see it in the 200% crop. Last thing we're going to take a look at is the flaring of this lens. So at 16 millimeters, we're going to go with the light inside the frame and then pan around. You can definitely see some of that stretching and distortion in the light here, where we're getting a lot more stretched out oval shape source instead of having a circular source like we saw with the 50 to 135. And we're getting a lot more flares in here as well. A lot of green colors and magenta purple colors. Now we're going to do the same thing, but put the light outside of the frame so we can see any flaring across with the light outside if we're getting any blooming. And it looks very similar to having it inside the frame. We're not getting any crazy streaks. You still see those colors. You get a little bit of a blue flare closer to the light source, which is kind of interesting, as well as some just sort of green glowing and blooming. If you look on the left side here as we go with the light down the right side, you do see some pretty hard lines of a purple and green blue shift in there because this is such a wide lens. Now we're going to jump into 28 millimeters and do the exact same thing. This one's a little more interesting around the source itself. You're seeing some of those really hard red and green and yellow colors in there, which you weren't seeing as much at 16 millimeters. And especially, when you go to the center here, you see those outer red rings around the source. Now we're going to go around the outside again, just to see how it flares across the frame so you get a good idea of what to expect with this lens. Very similar at 16 millimeters, a lot of green colors in there, but they're very smooth and you're not getting a ton of those elements like we saw with the 50 to 135. Hope you guys enjoyed this little test of the Tokina 16 to 28 Cinema Zoom. If you did and you want to try this lens out for yourself, I'll throw a link in the description below, so definitely go and check that out. If you want to see more lens tests just like this on the channel, make sure to hit that like button. Also, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button for new videos every single week, and I'll see you in the next one.